What if one of the most overlooked tools for calming the mind in prayer has been hidden in the church for centuries? If you live with tinnitus, hearing loss, or simply a mind that never seems to grow quiet, then you know how hard it can be to pray with peace. Silence can feel unreachable, focus can feel fragile, and prayer itself can begin to feel like a struggle. But for centuries, the Catholic Church has preserved a sacred language that many believers have experienced as deeply grounding, deeply reverent, and unexpectedly calming. Latin. Not as magic, not as a cure, but as a language set apart, one that may help draw the mind away from noise and toward contemplation. So the question is this: could praying in Latin actually help bring greater focus, steadiness, and peace, even in the midst of ringing, distraction, and inner noise? In this video, we'll explore why many believers find Latin prayer so powerful, and how it may help create a more contemplative rhythm, a deeper spiritual focus, and a stronger connection to the timeless prayer life of the Church. For centuries, Latin has held a sacred place in the life of the Catholic Church. It carries a sense of beauty, continuity, and reverence that sets prayer apart from ordinary speech. Although modern languages are now commonly used in prayer and liturgy, Latin remains an important part of the Church's spiritual heritage, linking Catholics across generations in a shared language of worship. But what makes Latin prayer so distinctive? And why do many believers still find it spiritually powerful today? Latin prayer carries deep historical, theological, and spiritual significance. Because it no longer changes through everyday use, it offers a remarkable sense of stability and continuity, helping preserve the wording and meaning of prayers across time. Its use in worship can also foster reverence by drawing the mind away from ordinary habits of speech and into a more sacred mode of attention. Praying in Latin reminds us that we belong to a universal church, joined not only to Catholics around the world today, but also to generations of saints and faithful who turn to God in these same ancient words. Many holy men and women of the Church cherished Latin prayer, not as a formula, but as a vessel of devotion, contemplation, and fidelity. For some people, especially those living with tinnitus, hearing loss, or mental restlessness, Latin prayer may also offer a quiet, practical benefit. Its cadence, repetition, and distance from everyday conversation can help create a more contemplative rhythm, giving the mind something steady on which to rest. This does not mean Latin is a cure, nor that it replaces medical care. But it may help some believers pray with greater focus, peace, and recollection. Above all, praying in Latin is not about fluency. It is about entering prayer with humility, trust, and a willingness to be drawn more deeply into the sacred life of the Church. Whether through the Rosary, the Mass, or a few simple prayers, Latin can become a gentle aid to reverence, clarity, and spiritual renewal. For many centuries, Latin has served as the principal sacred language of the Western Church. Because it no longer changes through everyday use, it has helped preserve prayers, liturgical texts, and theological formulations with remarkable continuity. This stability has made Latin especially valuable in the life of the Church, not only as a language of worship, but also as a sign of reverence and doctrinal care. As Christianity spread through the Roman world, Latin gradually became the common language of the Western Church for worship, theology, and teaching. What began as a practical development came to take on deeper significance, helping the faith be transmitted with consistency across regions and generations. By the 4th century, St. Jerome's Latin translation of Scripture, the Vulgate, had given the Church a text of immense importance. one that would shape prayer, preaching, doctrine, and devotion for centuries. Latin was preserved not only in books, but in lived practice, in chant, sacramental formulas, monastic prayer, theological study, public worship, and the rhythms of the liturgical year. Its endurance is therefore not merely literary or academic. It is liturgical, devotional, and communal. This helps explain why so many Catholics continue to encounter Latin not simply as an artifact of the past, but as a language still capable of carrying sacred memory into the present. For many centuries, Latin also gave the Roman Rite a striking, visible unity. Catholics could enter churches in different countries and encounter the same sacred language, structure, and basic rhythm of worship. Whatever their native tongue, they were reminded that the Mass belonged to the universal Church, and not merely to one local culture. That shared liturgical inheritance helped cultivate a deep sense of belonging. It is also worth remembering that Latin Mass is not always the most precise term. The ordinary form of the Roman Rite may also be celebrated in Latin. The distinction is not simply linguistic, but liturgical, involving the structure, texts, and rubrics of the form being used. Latin also carries theological significance because, as a language no longer shaped by daily conversation, it remains comparatively stable in meaning. That stability has made it especially fitting for sacred worship, where precision, continuity, and reverence matter deeply. Because it stands apart from ordinary speech, Latin can also help signal that prayer and liturgy belong to a different register of life, one oriented not toward casual exchange, but toward the worship of God. Even now, Latin remains part of the Church's official and liturgical life, especially in major texts, prayers, and formal expressions of doctrine. When Catholics pray in Latin, they are doing more than preserving an old custom. They are entering a tradition of worship that has formed saints, sustained devotion, and carried the faith across centuries. In that sense, Latin prayer can become an act of continuity, humility, and belonging within the enduring life of the Church. One of the greatest difficulties in prayer is distraction. The mind is easily pulled toward worries, responsibilities, memories, and inner noise. For those who live with tinnitus or hearing loss, that struggle can feel even more intense. Persistent ringing may make silence difficult to experience, and limited hearing can sometimes bring frustration or isolation in communal prayer. In that context, Latin prayer may offer a helpful kind of sacred focus. Because it is set apart from ordinary speech, it can create a sense of reverent distance from daily mental clutter and gently draw the heart toward contemplation. Latin prayer is not only spoken or read, it is also heard. For centuries, its vowels, cadence, and liturgical setting have shaped chant, hymnody, and public worship. That audible continuity can matter more than it first appears. Even when a person cannot clearly follow every sound, the language may still carry a recognizable sacred texture, measured, solemn, and distinct from ordinary conversation. For some believers, especially those burdened by auditory strain or mental restlessness, this sonic character may help create an atmosphere in which prayer feels less hurried, less scattered, and more inhabitable. Latin prayer may also be strengthened by memory. When a prayer has been learned deeply enough to live within the person, it remains available even in fatigue, sorrow, distraction, or sensory difficulty. In that sense, memorized prayer becomes a form of support. The believer does not always need to construct new words. Sometimes the ancient words of the Church are already there, ready to carry the heart toward God when concentration is weak. This can be especially meaningful in seasons of weakness, when attention is fragmented, when suffering is heavy, or when a person no longer has the strength to form many original words. Memorized prayer can become a hidden mercy. The soul does not begin from nothing each time. It is already carrying within itself a treasury of sacred language. In that way, Latin prayer may function not merely as an idea to be admired, but as a real interior resource, something stable enough to remain when energy, clarity, or emotional steadiness begin to fade. Many believers find that Latin helps prayer feel more intentional, precisely because it is no longer part of everyday conversation. Its unfamiliarity can slow us down, making us more attentive to the act of praying itself. For someone living with tinnitus, that steady rhythm may provide an anchor for attention, not by removing the sound, but by giving the mind something stable and prayerful on which to rest. For those with hearing loss, Latin may also carry a sense of permanence, quietly reminding them that even when physical hearing is limited, the soul remains capable of listening for God. Latin prayer may also deepen attention by interrupting the automatic habits that often accompany familiar language. When words are too familiar, the mind can drift. When prayer requires a little more intention, recollection often becomes easier. This is one reason practices such as the Latin Rosary can feel especially meditative. The repetition, cadence, and structure may help settle the mind into a quieter rhythm. For some who struggle with tinnitus, that rhythm can become a gentle support, helping attention rest more fully in prayer. Praying in Latin can also cultivate humility and patience. To learn even a few sacred prayers in another language requires attentiveness, reverence, and a willingness to slow down. In that sense, Latin prayer reminds us that prayer is not only about speaking, but also about listening, surrendering, and consenting to God's presence. Many saints cherished the liturgical and devotional life of the Church in Latin, finding in it a language of reverence and recollection. That same gift may still be available today. For those who live with tinnitus, hearing loss, or inner restlessness, Latin prayer may become a small refuge of order and beauty, a place where the soul can rest before God, even when the world feels noisy or distant. Latin has long served as a language of unity within the life of the Church. Even in an age when the liturgy is often celebrated in modern languages, it still reminds the faithful that Catholic worship reaches beyond any one nation, culture, or era. For those living with hearing loss or tinnitus, that continuity may be especially consoling, because it suggests that participation in prayer does not depend entirely on perfect hearing, but on belonging to the communion of faith. For centuries, this unity was experienced in a particularly visible way through the Roman liturgy. A Catholic could enter churches in different parts of the world and encounter the same sacred language, the same basic structure, and the same familiar rhythms of prayer. That consistency fostered a deep sense of belonging. Even now, the Latin Rosary and other traditional devotions continue to offer a shared form of prayer that crosses linguistic boundaries. For some who struggle with hearing in communal settings, such familiar and repeated patterns may also bring a sense of steadiness and reassurance. Latin also carries the believer beyond the present moment and into the wider memory of the Church. The saints, martyrs, clergy, religious, and faithful of earlier generations prayed in these same ancient words, and that memory can deepen one's sense of spiritual belonging. For those who suffer from hearing loss or tinnitus, this may be especially meaningful, because it gently reminds them that prayer is not confined to sound alone. It is an act of the soul, rooted in faith, sustained by grace, and shared within the communion of the Church. In that sense, Latin prayer becomes more than a custom from the past. It becomes a living bond with the Church across time. If this reflection spoke to you, I would like to invite you to take one simple next step. Through the link below, you can access the full Latin prayer selection from Hear Me, God, That I May Hear in audio form. This includes beautiful prayers to the Holy Trinity, to the Blessed Mother, to the Archangels, and to the saints. These are not empty words, and they are not merely historical formulas. They are sacred prayers that may help bring greater focus, greater calm, deeper faith, and in some cases, even significant healing. Sometimes it helps not only to read about prayer, but to hear its cadence, to hear its beauty, to let the soul rest inside words that have carried faith, reverence, and hope across centuries. If that speaks to something you need right now, you can find the audio through the link below. And if you know someone who may be longing for peace, steadiness, or spiritual strength in the midst of tinnitus, hearing loss, or inner noise, share this video with them as well. Even when the world feels noisy, the soul can still learn to listen for God.